Hi, I'm Jonathan Hafetz, and welcome to Law and Film, a podcast that explores the rich connections between law and film. Law is critical to many films. Film, in turn, tells us a lot about the law. In each episode, we'll look at a film that's noteworthy from a legal perspective. What issues does the film explore? What does it get right about the law, and what does it get wrong? How is law important to understanding the film? And what does the film teach us about the law and about the larger social and cultural context in which it operates? Our film today is The Return of Martin Guerre, a 1982 French historical drama directed by Daniel Vigne and starring Gerard Depardieu. The film describes the historical case of Martin Guerre, played by Depardieu, who leaves his young wife Bertrande, played by Nathalie Baye, in the small French village of Artigat to fight in a war and travel. Around 8 years later, the false Martin, it's the Depardieu character, returns to the village to resume the real Martin's life. This false Martin, whose true name is Arnaud du Tilh, persuades the people in the village that he is Martin Guerre, including Bertrande, with whom he goes on to have two children and who seems finally happy to have a husband who loves her, as opposed to her arranged and loveless marriage with the real Martin. But when the imposter Martin presses his uncle for money he's owed for his land, the uncle denounces him as a fraud. An investigation and trial follow to determine if the Depardieu character is the real Martin. The imposter Martin is on the verge of winning until the real Martin shows up at the final hour, exposing the imposter Martin, who then confesses. The imposter Martin, i.e. Arnaud, is then led to the gallows and hanged. Joining me to discuss The Return of Martin Guerre is Joseph Dellapenna. Joe is a visiting professor at the Peking School of Transnational Law in Shenzhen, China. Joe is also retired after 40 years of being a professor at Villanova School of Law, where his research and teaching interests included international and comparative law. Joe has also written a great piece about using films to teach comparative law. Joe, welcome to Law and Film.
Thank you.
In your long and distinguished teaching career, you've not only researched and written about comparative law, but you've also taught it. And part of your teaching has been to use film in teaching comparative law. So can you tell us a little bit about that process and why using movies like The Return of Martin Guerre makes sense in a classroom?
Well, to begin with, most of my students, and I think this is true of most law schools, it may not be true of a few, but for most law schools, very few of the students have ever been in a foreign classroom. Some of them have never been in a foreign country. And so I wanted to give them two things: a sense of the feel, if you will, of a foreign legal procedure, the look and feel of a foreign legal procedure, which you can certainly get from these movies. But I also wanted to give them a larger social context in which the legal proceeding takes place. And so I was looking for movies that satisfy both of those criteria, and I think Martin Guerre does so spectacularly well. It turned out to be much more of a problem than I had expected, because although we in the United States in particular, and almost any common law country, very accustomed to courtroom dramas on television, plays, movies, whatever, as a staple of entertainment, they're actually quite rare in non-common law countries, which itself tells you about the different role that courts play in that society compared to a common law country. But I managed to come up with a small number that I thought were excellent teaching tools, and Martin Guerre may be the best, although it is a historical drama. To understand why, one, why it's relevant in a comparative law class, and two, what I was hoping to achieve from it, you have to know a little bit about French legal history, which goes back to the Roman Empire. Gaul, as it was called before the Franks moved in, was part of the Roman Empire, thoroughly Romanized, subject to Roman law, and yet with the Franks and the Visigoths and the Burgundians and so on overrunning that part of the Roman Empire, Roman law was pretty much stamped out. But in the south of France, which is where this takes place, it survived as an oral custom, and it was used in the courts as customary law, and it became very corrupted compared to the classic Roman law. But when the classic Roman law was reintroduced after 1100 in the universities, the judges in the south of France quickly seized upon that, restructured their courts and their laws consistent with classic Roman law. And so by the time you get up to 1560 or so, when this takes place, it's very much a Roman law proceeding, very much a Roman law tradition as interpreted by the medieval mind. I teach all of this in my comparative law course because I want my students to understand where the modern day thinking of the civil law trained lawyers around the world comes from, and it comes right out of Roman law. And so what the movie represents in terms of the legal history situation is that transition point between the old customary law and the new written Roman law that was replacing it. And these judges were trained in the Roman law. They're not entirely comfortable with it. They still have uncertainties about what it means, and some of that is shown in the film. Now, you might ask yourself, well, how realistic is the film? The answer is very realistic. After I had shown this film to my class a few times, I was curious about certain features of it and whether they were actually in the original record of the case. And it turns out they are. The most dramatic incident in the movie is when the real Martin walks into the courtroom and says, "Here I am." And you say, "Oh, come on, that couldn't happen in real life." It's in the original record, just like, and so this record was dug out by a woman historian, Nathalie Baye, I think her name is, at Princeton, and translated and published and so on, and became the basis of the movie. And that record, interestingly enough, is written by a judge named Jean de Coras, who was an actual person, and this was based upon his actual record. And Jean de Coras is one of the three central characters in the movie. He represents the audience. He is the one who sees what the audience would be seeing, as opposed to the false Martin, as you called him, and Bertrande, his wife, who are, of course, the protagonists, the people who are struggling with the plot points of the movie, as you were. But it's all written down through the eyes of Jean de Coras, and we as the audience see it through the eyes of Jean de Coras.
So you mentioned Jean de Coras, who's the main judge on the Parlement of Toulouse. What exactly is this Parlement of Toulouse, and what function did it play at the time?
The word parlement, spelled slightly differently in French than in English, but basically means the place for speaking. And the English took that word to mean the legislature, eventually evolved into the legislature. But in France, it was a court, place for speaking, right? Where you make your arguments. And the Parlement of Toulouse was the High Court of Toulouse. Now, France was a highly feudalistic country until the French Revolution. In 1789, just before the French Revolution, France had 17 parlements. Each one is a Supreme Court. No court is supreme over any other. No parlement is supreme over any other, not even the Parlement de Paris. Parlement of Paris could not review the final decision. Oh, it would be as if we had 50 state Supreme Courts and no U.S. Supreme Court. And so the Parlement of Toulouse is the highest court in its region, which is a large region in southern France leading up to the Pyrenees and the Spanish border. And it was considered the second most important court in France, most prestigious court in France, shall we say. So that in itself was important. And Jean de Coras is one of the judges. Now, there are actually three stages to the legal proceedings here, and we only see two of them. The first one is kind of referenced at the beginning when Jean de Coras rides into town, because he's been sent from Toulouse as what we call the investigating judge. He's going to go in person and investigate this case. They don't have a prosecuting attorney. They don't have a defense attorney. A wealthy person could afford a defense attorney. A peasant like this, out of the question. So he's going to go there in person and conduct the investigation. Why did he go? Local magistrate was confronted with this claim that this is a charlatan, a fraud, an imposter. And the local magistrate doesn't know what to do. And so he's had his investigation, and he calls in Jean de Coras. And you see the local magistrate advising Jean de Coras at the beginning of the movie as to what the case is about. So that first proceeding is off camera completely. And as it should be, since Coras is writing about his experiences and not someone else's. Now, even as the investigating judge, if he feels comfortable doing it, he can gather the evidence, hear the evidence, make a decision, end a case. He's decided it. But through various machinations, it ends up at what we would call an appeal. They would call it as a transfer of the proceedings because he's already part of the Parlement in Toulouse. And indeed, he sits on the bench with the other judges when the whole case is heard. And the case is removed to Toulouse for the entire bench, 20 or 30 judges to hear it. Now, when you remove the case to Toulouse from this little village some distance away, in this case, that means you take the whole population of the village to Toulouse and house them in the courtyard of the court while the trial's going on, partly because many of them will be witnesses, partly because even those who are not witnesses will, if you will, witness the outcome. They will know that the trial's been conducted properly. So when they go back home, it's finished. Now, the issue, of course, he's been an imposter. If he's guilty, he's accused of being an imposter, which you could say is fraud. That has monetary dimensions. The initial reason he was accused of being a fraud, he comes home from the war. He ran away as maybe I should even start further back. Once Jean de Coras starts asking questions, then you have flashbacks, and the movie goes back to the marriage of two 14-year-olds, an arranged marriage between Bertrande, who has property because she's the only child of a man who's died, a farmer who's died. She's got her own farm, but she's not a man. She needs a husband. And she is being married off to the son, only child of the wealthiest farmer in the village. Arranged marriage. From the groom's family's point of view, they're getting more land and also a young woman to make babies. From her point of view, she's getting a protector and hopefully a loving husband, except this young man seems incapable of loving her. Now, right off the bat, one of the things you can see going on in this movie, as I've described it, is class conflict and gender conflict. She is, in a sense, being exploited. In a sense, she's exploiting them. Depends on how you look at it. But there's clearly gender roles are an issue, but class roles, because you've got the wealthiest family in the village, which is none too wealthy, but still better off. So there are jealousies. You see evidence of other peasants in the village who are jealous of them and not very friendly to them and take advantage of them. There's a hidden thread, at least as I watched the movie, there's a hidden thread of sexual orientation because there's a strong suggestion, to my mind anyway, it's never said explicitly, that the true young Martin is homosexual. That's his real problem. He lives with his wife, sleeps in the same bed for 3 or 4 years, and they never have sex until the night before he leaves. He's elaborate exorcism. The priest says, well, you're not having sex, it must be the devil. Elaborate exorcism, which succeeds. And so when he leaves, he actually leaves his wife pregnant, although he doesn't know that. And so you've got sexual orientation issues, and all cast in the context of 1560, the attitudes and so on of people in the 1560s, which were rather different from ours, to say the least. The marriage ceremony itself sounds more like a property transaction than it does what we would think of as the core issues in marriage. Do you know each other? Do you like each other? Do you love each other? No one cares. But how much property do you get and do you bring to the marriage? And how much, and what will your role be in managing property and so on and so forth? See, that's what's important about the marriage. Very different way of thinking about all of these issues. So you've got class, gender, sexual orientation issues, all nicely developed from my point of view anyway. And the young man runs off. He actually apparently joins the army. He's gone for 8 or 9 years and apparently no desire to come home. Even though he's learned that his wife gave him a son, he has no desire to meet his son, let alone return to his wife. And the false Martin was a soldier with him in the army. And they spent a lot of time together fighting the Spanish and apparently talking, and because false Martin learned a lot of information about the real Martin's life, his family, the village, who was nice to him, who was not nice to him. And so he knows all this stuff when he finally shows up and is mistaken for Martin. He doesn't say, I'm Martin, here I am. Someone says, you're Martin. And, he goes along with it as long as he can get away with it. And the actor who plays that role, Gerard Depardieu, was a well-established French actor, but largely unknown on the global scene until this movie. This movie is his breakthrough as a star. And it's interesting in that regard either, because he does a very good job. Nathalie Baye does a very good job as well, but she did not make the kind of career progression that Depardieu made out of this film. And I do want to throw in, I'm not sure this is going to be all logical. I do want to throw in, it is a beautifully staged and beautifully filmed movie. As I have said on other occasions, if you're familiar with the paintings of Peter Bruegel, Elder and Younger in Flanders, around the same time, this movie looks like a Bruegel painting brought to life in many ways. It's wonderfully done. But now becomes the question, is he or is he not? And the real crime is fraud.
He's charged with fraud, right? But there is also, it's wrapped up also, I think, in like the issue of, like there's adultery element, right? It seems there's the property element. Yeah, it's like, it's a fraud, you're the imposter. But, in terms of like the what the actual crime or specific crimes were, I don't know. It seems like a lot's packed up in that.
Well, the fraud, of course, was the accusation was it was fraud to acquire property that should have gone to the real Martin, although the real Martin's father had died, and the only man left around in the village from the family was the uncle, who then takes control of all the property and wants to keep control of all the property. And so the initial reason the uncle accuses the false Martin of being a fraud is because the false Martin says, I want my share of the property. And no, not your property. You're not even Martin. Now, were they concerned about the fact that he was committing adultery with Martin's wife? That is not made explicit, although it may well have been an aspect of it. The wife, as long as she can, I don't want to go into all the details of the movie, but as long as she can, stands by her new man, who treated her far better than the real Martin ever did. And one has the impression at the end of the movie, when she is left with the real Martin as her husband, that this might be the fate worse than death, but he's not a loving person. So she stands behind the false Martin as long as she can, but when it's clear that the game is up, she denounces him. And then one of the problems Jean de Coras has is, does he condemn her as a participant in the fraud, or does he excuse her, which he does? And they kind of mention, Jean de Coras in particular kind of mentions it. I have to excuse you. He doesn't quite put it this bluntly, but this is what it comes down to. I have to excuse you because otherwise your children will be bastards, illegitimate. And if we execute you for fraud, your children will die because no one will take care of them. But if you're alive and exonerated, then they're part of your family. And I think that's part of the reason, again, not made explicit movie, but I think that's part of the reason she denounces the false Martin, because she has to think of her children.
Yeah, it's unclear. That's sort of the ambiguous when she denounces him. She also, I think, in the movie sort of does so when she knows, well, she doesn't initially, but she's under pressure from the uncle and everything else. And then at the trial or the proceeding in the Parlement, she does it. But she says it was only after she sort of knew it was over for Martin, when the real Martin had shown up. But it's a great scene between her, Bertrande, and Jean de Coras at the end, where he comes to sort of talk to her post-trial. Martin's been condemned and tries to, explain what's going on, and says kind of basically, I think, sort of off the record, right? Did you know, right? Because she was probably the one that, of all the people, would have known the imposter, in the sense is, I think she says, she did. And, it's certainly, I think, very understandable, very defensible choice given her situation.
Yes. And I must say, although the young men in my classes kind of fell in love with Bertrande role watching it, the young women's hearts went out to her too, because they could see the problems she had in her life and her struggle to escape from those problems.
Yeah, I mean, you're rooting for, I don't know. I think the audience is sort of intended to root for the Depardieu character because it seems, a better outcome for everybody. And in a kind of a moral, ethical sense, maybe the just outcome. And also, like, I think, as you were saying, if Depardieu hadn't pushed it, right, if he hadn't sort of gone after the property, they probably all would have lived happily ever after, so to speak.
That's right. That's right. If he hadn't tried to get his hands on the property, no one would have questioned it. And if it hadn't been questioned, the real Martin probably never would have come home. He heard somewhere about this imposter trying to take his place, and he comes home to challenge him. And he heard about it because of this very widely known legal case. Otherwise, he seems to have no interest in returning home at all. We don't know for sure what happens between the real Martin and his wife after the execution of the false Martin, but I at least am left with the impression that one of his goals in life after that is to make her life miserable.
Precisely. Yeah, he's very cold and even crueler than he was before. Let's talk a little bit about the proceedings. You alluded to the different sort of common law versus the civil law inquisitorial system, which is the system that this trial operates within. What was the trial like? The proof, the evidence, the way that the sort of actual action in the trial?
Well, if it had happened 100 or 150 years earlier, probably trial would have been trial by ordeal, either trial by battle or trial by fire or water, which is basically, from a modern point of view, superstition. God will reveal the truth. You undergo the ordeal. If you survive the ordeal, then you're telling the truth. And if you don't, well, then you lost the case. You're also dead anyway, so it doesn't matter. But because of the rediscovery and reincorporation of Roman law into the court's proceedings, and they kind of illustrate this by having one or two of the judges question whether they should revert to divine truth-telling, which is rejected by the court. Jean de Coras becomes the spokesman for the majority. He says, no, we have to talk about the proper forms of proof, which require proof of fact. And also, they discuss the presumption of innocence, which was still a relatively new idea at that time, anywhere in Europe. And, that comes out of Roman law. Now, by presumption of innocence, they probably mean less than we might take it to mean, because all it means is burden of proof. If you haven't proven the case, he's innocent, which is part of our presumption of innocence too, but we draw certain further inferences from that, which I don't know that they would have, but it was an important transition from the idea that God would sort out the truth to the idea that we presume innocence. The one who wants to claim a crime was committed has to prove it. The investigating judge is much more active in, as you point out, in searching out the evidence and interrogating the witnesses and so on, which, although modern European proceedings are much more adversarial than this one would have been, nonetheless, judges in European systems are still much more actively involved in developing the evidence and interrogating the witnesses than a judge in an American or common law proceeding would be. So right there, you've got a very big difference in the look and feel of the proceedings. You also get to see, by the way, the pageantry, the kind of robes that the medieval judges wore and so on. And this idea that, which actually wasn't so, in this regard, not so very different from the common law courts at that time. The judge would not have been an inquisitor, but the various judges of one or another of the common law courts would ride circuit around England. One judge holds a trial. If the loser is unhappy, he doesn't appeal in the sense of a modern appeal to a higher court. He just asks the whole court to hear the case, and then it's taken to London. Here, we take it to Toulouse. And these courts in the Parlement in France were much bigger benches than you would have in one of the common law courts in England. Nowadays, of course, you have an appellate structure in France or wherever, much like our appellate structure. But one way in which procedure, if you will, of this case lives on in France is the first appeal. You have a trial before one judge or three judges, depends on the nature of the case in France, and decision. And in a criminal case, you get 3 judges and 9 lay people. It's not quite a jury because the 12 sit together and discuss it together. It's not like the jurors go off in the corner by themselves and make a decision. But nonetheless, you get this trial. And in France today, if you appeal to the Court of Appeals, the first appeal, you get a whole new trial. in that regard, it's more like what you see in this movie than it would be like a typical appellate proceeding in a common law country. And so in that sense, it's even enlightening about modern legal practice in Europe.
You mentioned before that most people didn't have lawyers and that someone in Martin's socioeconomic class would not have had a lawyer. So the Depardieu character, the false Martin, represents himself. And two things kind of struck me through the movie. One is during the legal proceedings, how effective the Depardieu character was as a lawyer representing himself. He was very good in his questioning of witnesses and his arguments to the Parlement. And then the second thing, which is related, is how much he knew and how good he was at being Martin. And there's a point where he seemed to know more about the real Martin than the real Martin did or remembered.
Wow, his memory is clear.
Yeah.
Now, you don't know, that's at the trial when the real Martin finally shows up and says, I'm Martin Guerre. And the false Martin challenges him, ask us questions, see who knows the right answer. And at a couple of points, the real Martin doesn't know the answer and the false Martin does. Now, you don't know whether sitting around the campfire at night in the army, he heard it and the real Martin forgot it and he didn't, or whether he heard it in the village, because this event in the village is after 3 or 4 or 5, they're not entirely clear, but 3 or 4 or 5 years after he came back to the village. So he's heard a lot from the people in the village during that period of time. So maybe that's why he knows some of the answers that the real Martin has forgotten. But he does seem to have a phenomenal memory, and he's very good at making logical arguments. He almost pulls it off even after the real Martin shows up. But a slip of the tongue does him in.
Yeah, that's right. He actually was about to knock back the challenge from the real Martin's dramatic entry, right? He comes in the courtroom and he's, all bedraggled and everything else, and he's still about to do it. And then it's a slip of the tongue that does him in.
And surprising enough, that's what John de Coras writes in his record. I found it online, at least Natalie Zaman Davis's translation online. And that's what's there. And, and you kind of look, oh, it's such a melodramatic ending that can't be true, but it turns out it is.
And so once the gig is up and he knows it, he confesses, throws himself on essentially the mercy of the court, the Parliament. But nonetheless, he's found guilty and the sentence is a capital sentence. So taken and brought to the front of the house where he lived in the village and hanged. Can you talk about the significance of the punishment, both in terms of the type and the way it was carried out, the execution?
Let me make a couple of points. Although it is in front of the house where he lived, I think it's more important because it was the largest public space in the village. Remember, this was the wealthiest family in the village. My impression. I may be wrong, but I don't think it was customary to execute someone at the scene of the crime, so to speak. The second point, that seems like a harsh punishment, but in fact, in the Middle Ages, all across Europe, including England and Germany, France, whatever, the normal punishment for any serious offense, including a lot of offenses that we might think of as serious today, was death. They did not have prisons. They had dungeons where they might hold someone. Personal enemy, the king, might be put in an iron mask, so to speak, and stuck away. But basically, they did not have prisons where they could have hundreds or thousands of criminals housed for a period of years until supposedly they've reformed. No, I mean, corporal punishment of one sort or another for any kind of what we would think of as a serious crime. Pickpocket, sentence, death, and so on. As I say, we would never contemplate death sentence for something like that, but that was normal. If it didn't rise quite to that level, then whipping or amputation of part of the, hand, branding on the face, these were considered normal punishment. Corporal punishment was the rule of the day. And for the vast majority of crimes, death was the sentence, unless the king gave you a pardon. Now, his execution is presented in the film as fairly brutal, and yet that was mild compared to the kind of executions that were routine in those days. You've heard the expression drawing and quartering someone. That began with hanging them, but not quite dead. Take them down, attach each hand and each foot to a different horse, and drag the horses until their body is literally torn into 4 pieces. That's your drawing and quartering. That was a common form of execution. And you could go on and on with the various beheading, of course, with an axe was also a common form of execution. So the one in the movie was actually, in terms of actual history, was actually fairly mild, as brutal as it seems to my eyes.
One element you mentioned is just the sort of reality. There were no prison, so kind of incarceration, post-trial
Right.
conviction incarceration wasn't a reality. And so certain serious crimes resulted in capital punishment. To what extent was there also an element in terms of the theory behind the punishment of a reinforcement of community norms, sending a
Oh,
message?
yes. Yeah, it was considered a deterrent. If the king was in a generous mood, he might pardon you and sell you into slavery, for example. You didn't necessarily go free, but slavery in the galleys, rowing in a boat for the rest of your life. It was a very harsh time, and it was felt that anything short of a harsh punishment would have no real deterrent effect. And also, of course, an educational effect. The condemned man is expected to march to the gallows, confessing his sin against God and against the king and begging their forgiveness. Otherwise, educating people that, God is watching and behave yourself. And so there's an educational element to it as well as a deterrent element. Again, it represents a totally different way of thinking than the modern, at least most people in the modern society think.
So at the end, Martin is hanged, just sort of the dramatic ending of the movie or towards the conclusion. In the postscript, that addresses the fate of Jean de Coras, the principal judge.
Yes, and that is also true. Perhaps one of the reasons why his account of the trial was not more widely famous after 1572. This was also taking place at the time of the Protestant Reformation, which was sweeping across Europe. And as you know, Northern Europe, all of Western Europe, all the way as far as Poland and Hungary was predominantly Catholic. And Northern Europe, Northern Germany, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, England, so on, broke off and became Protestant. But there were Protestant movements all across Europe, as well as survivals of Catholicism in various places across Europe. And this ended up in a series of wars, the Wars of the Reformation. It lasted from 1520 thereabouts to 1648, the end of the 30 Years' War. And there might be a period of 10 years of peace and then another war and another 10 years of peace and another war and so on and so forth for 130 years. And this was right in the middle of that, 1560. Now, it turns out it's not mentioned in the movie at all. It doesn't overtly play a role in the movie, although perhaps after you see the postscript, you might go back and rethink what you thought about Jean de Coras when some of the judges say, let God decide. That sounds more like a Catholic. And he's saying, no, we must use reason. We must use proof. That sounds more like a Protestant. Others listening to this podcast might object to the way I've split it out, but that's part of what's going on here. And these wars convulsed France as well as the rest of Europe. And the Protestants in France were called Huguenots. And Jean de Coras, we're told in the postscript, was a Huguenot. And the most famous incident in the bloodletting between the Catholics and the Protestants in France is called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, because on St. Bartholomew's Day, it was agreed in advance, the Catholics attacked and slaughtered all over France thousands of Huguenots, effort to suppress them. And the postscript says Jean de Coras was murdered with several hundred of his friends. That would have been just in Toulouse. You've got the whole rest of France going on at the same day, same time. And suddenly his way of thinking, why he's different from some of the other people in his thinking, begins to make more sense. Now, whether there was any division, religious division in the village or not, there's no hint in the movie. And yet the village cannot escape this larger turmoil. One of the reasons the real Martin can serve, or the false Martin for that matter, can serve 8 or 9 or more years in the army for so long, constantly fighting wars, is these were the wars of religion. And they just went on and on. And so a young man who was unhappy with his life, a young woman, a little more difficult. There are stories of various women, not very many, but some women who managed to pass themselves off as men and serve in the army. But for the most part, it was men. A young man who was unhappy with his life could run away and join the army. A dangerous life, difficult life, but it might be better than the life he left behind. And that's sort of a background to this whole story.
Yeah, it's a fascinating context for the movie. I mean, the other thing is, when you think about it now, is today the dispute, one would assume, would be resolved fairly easily. Documentary evidence, DNA testing, but it's difficult, right, to resolve at the time.
No photo ID, that's for sure. Births, marriages, deaths, other important events were recorded by the curé, the parish priest. And the parish priest becomes an important source of information, which would have been true. Important source of information in the legal proceeding, because he not only officiated at these various events, but he kept the written record of them. And so he could consult his written record, but you're still dependent upon his memory as, is this the real Martin or isn't this the real Martin? And so you see, that's another aspect that the movie plays up. It's not a pedantic movie. It doesn't try to explain or lecture to you about this is what this means and that is what that means. So they never talk about the role of the priest, but it's very clear he is a central character because he is people look to as sort of the official memory of the village. This is a movie that bears watching 2 or 3. I've seen it about 40 times because every time I show it in my class, I watch it. But bears watching more than once because you learn, you see things the second or third time you watch it that you never noticed the first time. At the end, when he's confessing in court, he says, I didn't plan taking Martin's place. They recognized me. They thought they recognized me. And I just went along with it as sort of a joke to see how far I could get. Is that true? Well, if you watch the movie a second time with that question in mind, you discover his joking manner, which the first time when they first say you're Martin, you don't notice it the first time you watch the movie, and so on. It bears watching more than once if you're interested in it.
It's so rich from so many different perspectives, the legal history perspective, the social, cultural, class, gender. I mean, there's so much packed up in it. And I'll say, while it's a movie about, mid 16th century France, and it's not an action movie, it's incredibly dramatic, entertaining, gripping. I mean, it is a movie that, I think really kind of grabs you.
Yeah, it is. Excellent movie. And, even if you're only interested in seeing how people dressed back then, it's well worth a watch.
Amazing attention to detail, as you say, like a Bruegel painting.
Yeah.
Well, Joe, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast. It's been great to talk to you about Martin Guerre and legal history. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Do it again sometime.